All right, last presentation for today. This may have to be a short one because my time, once again, will run out. It takes time to set up the camera and all, get it just right. It may not be just right. I don't know. I hope anybody see me out there by a plant wall or something. I hope I'm visible. And so in about 21 minutes, I may have to stop this presentation, especially if somebody is waiting for this room. And if not, I may be able to squeeze in a few more minutes. So I thank you very kindly. I want to make one more additional point that's redundant, one additional point to quote from Father Salvati, who wrote his book Liberalism, What is Liberalism, which has been published under Liberalism is a Sin, published in 1899. And this marvelous summary here of liberalism. He gave you the four basic premises of it, but I do think it's worthwhile going over this one passage, and then I'll apply this obviously to the hatred of Catholics by many of the leading of the Founding Fathers, even though many of the leading Catholics at the time made their accommodation with the Founding Fathers. Such is the source of liberalism in the order of ideas. It's veritable social atheism, as he calls it. Such in the consequences of our Protestant and infidel surroundings is the intellectual atmosphere which we are prepared breathing into our souls. Nor do these principles remain simply in the speculative order. Pardon me. Oh, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, let me save souls. Poised forever in the region of thought. Men are not mere contemplatives. Doctrines and beliefs inevitably precipitate themselves into action. The speculation of today becomes the deed of tomorrow. Therefore, it takes concrete shape in the order of facts. The deed of tomorrow for men, by force of law of their nature, are ever acting out what they think. Rationalism, therefore, takes concrete shape in the order of facts. It finds palpable expression and action in the press, in legislation, and in social life. The secular press reeks with it. This is 1899, mind you. Proclaiming with almost unanimous vociferation absolute division between public life and religion. And most Catholics believe that then as well, as they do today in the United States. It has become the shibboleth of journalism, and the editor who will not recognize it in his daily screed soon feels the dagger of popular disapproval. In secularized marriage and in our divorce laws, it cleaves the very roots of domestic society. In secularized education, the cardinal principle of our public school system, it propagates itself in the hearts of the future citizens and the future parents, even more so today, obviously. In compulsory school laws, it forces in the entering wedge of socialism. In the speech and intercourse of social life, it is constantly asserting itself with growing reiteration. In secret societies, organized in a spirit destructive of religion and often for the express purpose of exterminating Catholicity. It menaces our institutions and places the country in the hands of conspirators whose methods and designs beyond the reach of public eye constitute a tyranny of darkness. We must understand that we live in the darkness in this country. And if you think we're going to get out of it at the voting booth, as I've explained before, you can believe whatever you want. I used to believe that. I wrote a book about it. I was wrong. Political ecumenism is as wrong as theological ecumenism. The errors here are vast. There's no turning this around right now. Naturalistically speaking, prayer, penance, sacrifice, trusting in God, cleaving to our dear Blessed Mother. That's, at this point, what we can do. And as we seek to inform ourselves about the truths of the Holy Faith and to make no concessions to the prevailing errors of the day, in the name of progress, of a new age philosophy, new age meditations condemned by Holy Mother Church as anathema to the good of souls. Breathing exercises, meditation, all of this diabolical form of self-indulgence that proceeds from the errors of modernity. Yet Catholics continue to make their accommodations with those things that give honor and worship to the devil, and not the most blessed Trinity, even though people think they are worshiping the most blessed Trinity. Truly is phenomenal. As noted in one of my earlier presentations, many of the leading so-called founding fathers in this country were upset that in 1774, I think I misspoke in one of the earlier presentations. I said it was 1773, the Quebec Act. It was 1774, June 22nd, 1774, 175 years before my graduation from high school on that same day, Feast of St. Paulinus of Nola. But many of the leading founding fathers were opposed to the Quebec Act, which granted toleration to Catholics in French Canada. Not to Acadia. This is because that occurred after the derivation, the expulsion of the Acadians, and I want to talk about that in a slightly different context in my next presentation, because anyone who would praise life in the 13 colonies and how great the people were there, how working they were, how dedicated to liberty they weren't dedicated to liberty, because you had over 2,000 Acadians, French Catholics in Acadia, now called Nova Scotia, New Scotland, who were expelled from Acadia in 1755, and many of them who tried to find refuge, who escaped. 2,000 escaped, in addition to those who were sent out. And and as I said, with over 3,700 Acadians were dispersed along the coast of the British colonies of America in 1755. And some of them were, when they sought refuge in places like Boston, they were treated like slaves. And in Connecticut, they persuaded them to leave, treated them miserably. In New York, some of them were persuaded to go to Santo Domingo. The Catholics were not welcomed by these so-called liberals, tolerant great Americans. They hated Catholics. I'll talk about the dérangement, one of the greatest persecutions in the history of man, because the French Catholics would not apostatize and accept the English, the Anglican so-called Mass, the Anglican liturgy. They would not give up their Catholic faith, just like the Catholics in England, who remained faithful, would not give up their faith at the time of the Protestant revolt. They would rather die than apostatize. How many people accept the false religion today of conciliarism? Some of them accept it because, well, it will cost me too much. I know what's true, but boy, I'm going to lose that big position I've got. Oh, my wife will be upset with me. I can't do it. All manner of human respect. I'll divide people. People will think ill of me. They'll think me disloyal or schismatic. I want to go into the Acadians to show you a contrast in the next presentation between the fidelity of French Catholics in Acadia. Many of them settled, they settled in Acadiana, Louisiana. And their descendants, many of them are today the Cajuns of Acadiana. Those wonderful people we love so much. Many of them will go to Father Francis Miller's Christ the King Church in Lafayette, Louisiana. There is hardly a more thoroughly Catholic area in the country than Acadiana. Even those who are in the Novus Ordo have maintained the vestiges of the faith. They take their Lent seriously. And they love their Catholic faith, even though they don't understand what has happened. But I want to go over the American Catholic accommodation to the anti-Catholic so-called patriots who opposed the Quebec Act in contrast with the fidelity of the Acadians. But I want to go over what happened later before I want to go over what happened first, just to give you a contrast, and that will be in the next presentation. Those who were so dedicated to liberty obviously weren't dedicated to liberty for all. And it was the same hatred of Catholics that was demonstrated for the exiled Acadians, many of whom had been living there for a century and a half. Their families had lived there for a century and a half. That caused colonists to consider the Quebec Act as intolerable. One of the intolerable acts, as it was a sign, at least to them, that the British were beginning to slacken in their resolve against popery. And the truth of the matter was, the act demonstrated British pragmatism in the face of a populace more numerous and prosperous than were the Acadians who were dispersed in Nova Scotia. As they could disperse the Acadians. The Quebecers they needed to have cooperation with because they were more numerous and more prosperous. They weren't the fishermen of Acadiana, the farmers of Acadiana. They were more prosperous, more numerous. They would tolerate them, not others. Robert Leckie, in his book, American and Catholic, published by Doubleday in 1970, described the flames of hatred that were fanned by the anti-Catholic propaganda in the colonies of the immediate aftermath of the Quebec Act in 1774. This piece of legislation had not only confirmed the French in the free exercise of their religion and the practice of their native law, but it also granted to the Quebec government those lands in the West which the English colonies claimed. Now the colonists fancied themselves surrounded by French-speaking Catholics, the old enemy of former years, and their rage was so unbounded that on October 24, 1774, the First Continental Congress addressed a letter to the British people admonishing them for tolerating in America a religion which has deluged your island in blood. I'll give you some names of those who signed this decree, who were at the Continental Congress. A religion, meaning Catholicism, which has deluged your island in blood. Excuse me, Henry VIII killed 72,000 Catholics between 434 and 1547, and dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world. This was the hatred of Catholicism by your so-called founding fathers. Once again, this is Robert Leckie now quoting. It was popular to quote Samuel Adams, who had said 6 years earlier, that is in 1768, something I quoted to you before, "I did verily believe, as I still do, that much more is to be dreaded from the growth of popery in America than from the Stamp Act or any other acts destructive of civil rights." End of quote. Robert Leckie went on to say, once again, the popular press picked up the old anti-Catholic cudgels. 1774. One journal went so far as to predict, quote, "We may live to see our churches converted into mass houses and our lands plundered by tithe for the support of the popish clergy. The Inquisition may erect her standard in Pennsylvania, and the city of Philadelphia may yet experience the carnage of St. Bartholomew's Day, which was even condemned by the Holy See, the slaughter of Protestants in France on St. Bartholomew's Day. Holy people, Catholics have sinned at various times. It doesn't mean the church is responsible for the sins of her children. Others, this is Robert Leckie, and so This is one newspaper quoted by Robert Leckie. The Inquisition's coming to Pennsylvania, and this will be St. Bartholomew's Day in Philadelphia. All of this rabid anti-Catholicism. Others, misrepresenting the truth of the Quebec Act, insisted that it actually established Romanism as an official religion. It did not, but they tolerated it. And warned if Gallic papists have a right to worship their own way, then farewell to liberties of poor America. And Robert Leckie went on to say, ministers, of course, were in full voice once more, but also were John Adams, apparently recovered from his momentary lapse into tolerance when he had visited a Catholic church and was somewhat impressed with the rites. As I've given you examples earlier of his anti-Catholicism, his mockery of our Lord. Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, the inevitable Samuel Adams, and none other than Washington's protege and confidant, Alexander Hamilton, who thundered at the Continental Congress, quote, if Parliament had any regard to the freedom and happiness of mankind, they would not have done it. If they had been friends to the Protestant cause, they would never have provided such a nursery for its greatest enemy. They may as well establish popery in New York and other colonies as they did in Canada. End of quote from Alexander Hamilton. Praise Alexander Hamilton. One more passage from Robert Leckie's Catholic and American and Catholic. More than the Stamp Act, perhaps more than any other act by Parliament or any British minister, the Quebec Act was a direct cause of the American Revolution. It so inflamed colonial hatred of the mother country that even that staunch and solid Protestant King George III was accused of being a Jesuit in disguise, and his statues, from which the rebels later were to melt so many serviceable bullets, were adored with mocking rosaries. They mocked the rosary, these people. I don't hate our country. I love our country. But we don't idolize the country or the men who hated the true faith and therefore sowed the seeds for the current disorder. Current disorder is a result of their false ideas, their false declaration of independence. A constitution founded on the false belief that men could proceed on their own without reference to the true faith and be virtuous, without belief in access to and cooperation with sanctifying grace, and without acknowledging the true church as the mother and teacher of all men. You don't do that, you're destined to collapse on its own, to the point of being so weak, the barbarians from without will take advantage of the barbarism from within. Leckie went on to say, meanwhile, patriots such as Paul Revere, another great fellow, he's so extolled by homeschooling organizations and by the Constitution Party, which is why I can't support it. Paul Revere memorabilia, Paul Revere souvenirs, Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a blasphemer. He was a hater of the true God of divine revelation, a hater of divine revelation, an enemy of social order. Don't extol this man. Meanwhile, patriots such as Paul Revere did a brisk business in scurrilous engravings which depicted His Majesty and ministers clothed in the livery of the Pope of Rome. To the Catholics of colonial America, who actually represented no more than 1% of the total population of 3 million persons, it appeared that it was time to pull tight the shutters again, and it was this furor of anti-Catholic sentiment that rose about the ears of Father John Carroll when he returned to his native Maryland in 1774 after his studies abroad. And look at those names once again. John Adams, Samuel Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Paul Revere, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. These are not men to admire, as I've just noted. They hated our blessed Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and His true church. She, that is the one and only foundation of personal salvation and social order. And Father Carroll, even though he was somewhat shocked at the horror of at the passage of the Quebec Act, chose to cooperate with the so-called patriots so that he could prove he was a good American. Thus began, formally speaking, the accommodation of Catholic bishops in this country. He wasn't yet a bishop, but of the future first bishop of this country, to the desire to show to the civil rulers that Catholicism was safe for America. That we did not mean, Catholicism did not mean, Catholics did not mean to convert the United States of America. That Catholics, the tiny minority of Catholics then here, was as opposed to the Quebec Act as were patriots, because they were good patriots too. The same thing that happened during World War I. When James Cardinal Gibbons, the Americanist Archbishop of Baltimore, wanted to prove American Catholic loyalty by fully supporting this unjust, immoral, needless involvement of the United States in a thoroughly unjust, needless war of nationalism, World War I. And it was such a spirit of independence from interference that had developed among Catholics in the colonies that Father John Carroll defied his own bishop, Bishop Richard Challoner, after whom the Challoner Douay Reims Bible is named, after he had been assigned to oversee the dismantling of the Society of Jesus following its suppression by Pope Clement XIV on July 21st, 1773. And this is what Robert Leckie wrote about Carroll's defiance of Bishop Challoner. Although shocked by the enmity which passage of the Quebec Act had unleashed against his faith, Father Carroll nevertheless sided with the Patriots in their dispute with England. He proudly followed the career of his famous cousin, Charles, sympathizing with his Republican convictions and becoming so independent-minded himself that he refused his obedience to Father John Lewis, acting as Bishop Challoner's Vicar General. By this act, like so many of his fellow priests in America, he made it clear that he had no wish to submit to ecclesiastical authority based in England. Nevertheless, John Carroll was far from enthusiastic when his cousin Charles approached him with the astounding invitation to help win the Catholics of Canada to the Patriot cause. And anti-Catholics, though, end of quote from Robert Leckie, anti-Catholics, though the leading colonists may have been, they were also as pragmatic as their British overlords. Some of those leading colonists believed that a way could be found to win over the Catholics to the Patriot cause, an invitation that suited the purposes of the Carrolls of Maryland in order to win acceptance of the general tolerance for their co-religionists in each of the colonies when they became independent United States of America. And the mission to Quebec that Father John Carroll undertook with his cousin, a master mason, Charles Carroll, and the chief of the Masons in the English colonies, Benjamin Franklin, began the official co-opting of leading Catholics by men who had no use for the faith, other than to use its adherents for their purposes, for promoting the new science of politics, as I mentioned before, represented by their false ideas. This is not an exaggeration. Leading American patriots sought to do this very explicitly, something that Leckie demonstrated without understanding that he was doing so in American and Catholic. Robert Leckie made a lot of wonderful points without realizing what he was making. He was proving the triumph, the subordination of Catholics in the United States to the prevailing ethos of that which was opposed to the faith. After his first outbursts against the Quebec Act, Congress, the First Continental Congress, had second thoughts about Canada. On the very same day that it excoriated King George for tolerating in America a religion which has deluged your land in blood, they addressed a quite dissimilar letter to the people of Quebec, inviting them to join the fight against tyranny and declaring, "We are too well acquainted with the liberality of sentiment distinguishing your nation to imagine that difference of religion will prejudice you against a hearty enmity with us. You know that the transcendent nature of freedom elevates those who unite in her cause above such low-minded infirmities. The Canadians, however, were also too well acquainted with the true religious sentiments of the Protestants of the South, according to Robert Droleskey, and they angrily spurned the overtures of what they called the perfidious Congress. Moreover, Bishop Jean-Olivier Briand de Quebec deeply distrusted the Americans and forbade any of his flock to join them under penalty of excommunication. Thus Canada remained loyal to the Crown, British Crown, and in 1775 Congress, despairing of diplomacy, authorized a two-pronged military assault on Montreal and Quebec under Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold. Although this expedition ultimately ended in failure, Congress flip-flopped back to diplomacy again. Already aware that the traditional American hatred of Catholicism was going to have to be muted during the war against England, it authorized a new diplomatic mission to Canada charged with impressing upon the Canadians its newfound tolerance of popery. In other words, we'll pretend we're tolerant of popery, we'll free you from England, we'll let you be, just agree with us. Benjamin Franklin, in other words, what Obama is saying today. You can practice your faith privately, but I'm not going to let you do it publicly. That is, it will have no influence upon public affairs. Benjamin Franklin was the obvious choice, Lucky noted, to lead the embassy, and John Adams and John Carroll went along. And only a corrupted version of Catholicism, ladies and gentlemen, displays liberal sentiments within a large mind and is a manifest trend of civil liberty. In other words, the Catholicism desired by Charles Lee and other anti-Catholics in the colonies was safe Catholicism. Although it took much time and many struggles of one sort or another, the safe, acceptable brand of Catholicism that emerged after the Revolutionary War was a prophetic harbinger of the safe Catholicism that now exists in the entire world. It is called the counterfeit church of conciliarism, that most people in the world believe is the Catholic Church, but is in fact counterfeiting. And it was in, as I noted, that mission to Quebec in 1774 that the colonial elite began to realize that they could neutralize popery by extending leading papists some baubles of recognition, thus convincing them that they could all live together in peace and brotherhood while they, the Catholics, surrendered the claim, any claim to seek the conversion of the country to the true faith. Furthermore, the colonial elite believed that the Catholics could be convinced to stand up to any kind of Roman interference in their internal affairs in an independent American nation in the same way they were standing up to King George III and the military might of the British Empire, quoting from my own text there in the version in reverse. From the very beginning, there's nothing new. It's because we've been sold a bill of goods and we've been told everything was right, everything was conformable between the American way and the faith, and so many Catholics have been blind. I was for many years myself, for about 34, 35 years, blind myself, who can't help but be. Many people raised in good Catholic families had access to the truth. I did not at that time. I was fed even in parochial school, Americanism. I taught it. I later renounced it. One of the reasons, among many others, I have to do much penance for my sins is I taught error. I thought it was possible to use the prevailing structures of this country to seek to convert the nation. I've always desired to convert the nation. I had to be challenged, as I explained before, to reject the false premises, to study what the Church teaches, to study true history, and to quit extolling the Founding Fathers. Men who from the very beginning sought to co-opt the leading Catholics in the 1770s in order to neutralize them by showing favors upon them, and it's the same today. Behold the results. The answer, Our Lady's Fatima message. We pray our rosary.